Hey everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to another class in our course on the Pentateuch, and today we are at beautiful Zion National Park, a place of immense natural beauty. You can see the colors at sunset here, it's just perfect. It's appropriate that we come here, still in rural Utah, as we conclude our discussion of different methodologies for studying the Pentateuch. We've spent the last two classes looking at different diachronic approaches. Today we're going to look at the synchronic approaches to studying the Pentateuch, specifically narrative analysis. Let's look at our agenda for today. First, we're going to talk about what synchronic analysis is and what narrative analysis is. Then we're going to talk a little bit about historically why it's emerged and why it's become influential, especially within Catholic circles. And then we're going to look at some of the how-tos. How do we employ narrative analysis, this synchronic approach to exegesis, as we look at the Pentateuch? So first, what is synchronic analysis? I showed you this slide a couple of classes ago when I was distinguishing diachronic from synchronic. A reminder, diachronic analysis studies the text as it evolved through time. Synchronic analysis studies the final form of the text as it exists with time. That is, after everything that happened that led it to come into its final form, we're studying it as it appears in our Bibles of today. There are several different kinds of synchronic analysis. We're going to focus principally in this course on narrative analysis because the Pentateuch is in fact a narrative. So why do we have it? Why has it emerged? And the story really begins in 1981. A very influential book called The Art of Biblical Narrative was published by Robert Alter, a Jewish scholar who's written much over the last 40 years. Indeed, a couple years ago, he published his own translation of the Hebrew Bible. Alter was able to do something very different. He was able to take what many scholars for the last couple centuries had assumed were different sources just stitched together more or less haphazardly. He was able to present a compelling case for why the inspired author put the material together in the order in which he did. Why does the narrator, for example, digress seemingly for a chapter before coming back for a topic? And so since 1981, scholarship, and again within Jewish, Protestant, and Catholic circles, these scholars were able to say it's a both and. Yes, the text emerged over time. Yes, there are different sources that come from different points of view, but they were intelligently pulled together. They're there for a reason. We can appreciate the text as it exists in its final form and see not just a point to it all, but see a genuine beauty. You'll notice on your screen I've put a number of different names. Alter and Sweeney are both Jewish. Ska is Catholic, teaches at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome. Blenkinsop teaches at the University of Notre Dame, also a Catholic institution. So you can see this is an approach to scholarship that has emerged really across confessional lines. You'll also notice I put some representative quotations from Alter's and Ska's work talking about how synchronic analysis can help us, working together with diachronic analysis, to help us understand the text as it exists. You'll see that both Alter and Ska in their own ways argue that synchronic analysis can help us make the most out of the text that we have. So that's what's happening in the Academy. I also want to talk a little bit about what's been happening within the Church, within the Catholic Church and the Magisterium since the 1980s. In 1988, then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who was the head of the CDF, of course, gave a major speech in which he sought to diagnose some exaggerations with the historical critical method. And he argued for a synthesis between the Church Fathers and the medievals with the historical critical method to arrive at a synthesis for the best parts of the two. One of the things that Ratzinger was pointing to is that there's a unity to Scripture. Synchronic analysis helps us see the bigger picture. One of the cool things that happens when you're the head of the CDF is that you're also ex officio the president of the Pontifical Biblical Commission, which means you get to set the agenda. Cardinal Ratzinger did that to have the Pontifical Biblical Commission, this community of 20 different Catholic scholars from all around the world, to study what it means to be a Catholic biblical scholar. And the results of that discussion are the 1993 document, The Interpretation of the Bible in the Church, the document I showed you a couple of classes ago, which praises both diachronic and synchronic. It tells us, yes, we need the historical critical method. It's indispensable, but it's not sufficient. We have to be able to study the final form. And so synchronic analysis is praised, and narrative analysis in particular is singled out for its effectiveness in studying narratives. Of course, Cardinal Ratzinger was eventually elected Pope Benedict XVI, and much of the stuff that he had been saying in the 80s and 90s, he included in his 2010 Apostolic Exhortation, Verbum Domini. So what had become a Catholic conversation eventually found its way into a magisterial text. So let's talk now a little bit about how we employ narrative analysis. And I'm going to throw a number of terms at you here. For our purposes right now, it's not about memorizing terms, it's about seeing how these different terms provide us useful avenues of inquiry. We're reading a narrative, these are the kinds of things we're trying to notice. This is about issue spotting. It's about training our eyes to read the text carefully and noticing the subtle camera work that the narrator engages in. Keep in mind, when we're reading a narrative, we only know what the narrator chooses to tell us. If the inspired author doesn't think it's important, we don't know about it. So we want to pay attention to the camera work that the inspired author engages in. We can first look at the different levels of composition. You'll often hear me use this expression, the limits of the text. That's a term of art that describes where a story begins and where it ends, or where a piece of poetry begins and ends. And I have to have some justification for why I begin a story in point A and end it at point B, keeping in mind that chapters and verses are somewhat arbitrary. That's not a good reason. When we talk about a narrative or a story, we mean a single unit that includes at least one character, a plot, and a resolution. In other words, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But we're going to see, especially as we look at Genesis, that the different narratives are grouped into scenes and acts. We often also use the word cycle, this comes from the French usage, to describe a group of stories that have a single main character. So we'll talk about the Abraham cycle in Genesis, or the Jacob cycle, the Joseph cycle, in other books, the David cycle and the Elijah cycle. You've probably seen this narrative arc before. You probably learned this in high school or college or some other place, but it's true of biblical narratives as it is of any other narrative. There's an introduction, there's an inciting moment, there's something that gets the action going. We sometimes call that the complication. We have rising action until we reach a climax, and then there's the falling action, the dénouement in French, leading to a resolution. A handful of things I'd like to point out further in particular. The author-reader-text relationship. Scholars make a distinction between the implied reader and the real reader. You and I are the real reader. We're the ones who are actually reading Genesis. But the inspired author had an audience in mind. We want to see who that audience is. What inferences can we make to tell us about that implied reader, and how can we be sympathetic or maybe acknowledge we're very different from that point of view? The same thing is true of the author. There's a real author, that is, who historically put words on paper, which we'll never fully know, versus the implied author. What can we infer about the author's position? Point of view, is this told in the third person? Is it told in the first person? That's significant. Also, people in the text. We talk about different characters. Dramatis personae is just the fancy Latin way of saying the characters in the drama. Round versus flat characters. A round character is one that we can put our arms around, one that we can get to know. We know the character's attributes, characteristics. A flat character exists only to do something, and we don't get to find out much about the person at all. Keep in mind, for both people and places, names often matter. With places, etiologies, that is, Genesis especially, but other books in the Pentateuch, tell stories about where something came from. This is why we. When you see words like that, there's a symbolic value. The place or the person or the incident matters. It's speaking to a situation that would come up later in Israel's history. You can also see on your screen here a number of different literary devices. In the brown square, we have time in a narrative. We distinguish between narration time, which refers to the amount of text used to tell a story. It's measured in words or paragraphs or sentences, versus narrated time, which is the time, the clock time that elapses within the story, measured in hours, minutes, days, something like that. Notice sometimes the story breaks. We have violations of time. We hear about something before the characters in the story do. All of that produces irony. You'll also want to be on the lookout for repetitions, themes that occur throughout, say, the book of Genesis or Exodus, as well as something that occurs often in the Hebrew Bible, binarity. The same thing said twice, and we'll define these terms in greater detail as we go through the course. You can see we have a lot in our toolbox. We have a lot we can use as we study these inspired texts. I look forward to doing it with you all. Until our next class, read well and pray well.